afternoon, good evening. We've got lots of you joining from all around the world. So very excited for our 5th In Conversation With, brought to you by Civil Service College, based here in London. I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce our guest today, Sir Philip Rutnam. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation, Kat.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. We're going to be talking today about leadership lessons, and in particular, how do we future-proof the sector? But before we get started, just for those of you who might be joining one of our In Conversations for the first time, just want to explain a little bit about how this works. So we are broadcasting live from our office in London. So the purpose of this conversation is it's supposed to be a live conversation between Philip and I, and we would really love to hear from you who are joining, whether you're from your office or your home office. And so please do use the chat if you would like to ask any questions or make any comments throughout the conversation. This is your conversation, and if you are watching this back, hopefully you're finding this interesting. So we can see quite a few people joining. We've got nearly 100 people joining, Philip, so no pressure. But this is absolutely fantastic. This is the first In Conversation we've tried a different time during the day. So it'll be interesting to see. Please do tell us as well in the chat if this time works better for you, because we've been doing it in AM in the UK so far. So any questions or comments, please put them in the chat. My colleague Chris is here to help us with that. If you have any technical issues, if we lose sound or anything, obviously just pop that in the chat. We are recording this, as always. It will be available on our YouTube channel shortly after we go live today. If you've got any thoughts, questions or comments, perhaps about future topics, I would really love to hear them, because this is the last one for 2023. So without further ado, thank you so much for taking the time. I can see we're over 110 people now, which is amazing. So I just want to say thank you to you for taking your time today to listen to our conversation on what is a very, very important topic. I think it's fair to say, Philip, we've been through a very challenging time, haven't we, these past few years?
In the UK, yes, and in some ways around the world.
Yes,
agreed.
Absolutely. So perhaps before we get into the sector itself, it would be really great, I think, for all of us to hear a little bit of insight and background into your experience in the public sector, if that would be okay.
Okay. Well, maybe just before that, just a little bit about myself. So I grew up on the edge of London, where London then used to turn into the countryside. Since then, London has expanded a bit more.
Yes.
We're talking a long time ago. Pretty family, it wasn't rich, wasn't poor, kind of modest background. My mum worked as a secretary. My dad worked in a bank till he lost his job, and then he set up a small business. But they really believed in education. So they've now both passed on, but the really fantastic thing they did for me and for my siblings was invest heavily in education. And that then really helped me to join the public sector, the public service here in the UK, in what was then known as the fast stream for the civil service. And I did that. I decided to do that when I was at university, because I thought that was going to be the most rewarding career I could choose, and I never regretted it. Ups and downs, yes, along the way, but I have had the most fantastically interesting, rewarding, responsible time as a public servant, and I would continue to recommend it as a career to anybody, with all its frustrations. So I worked in the Treasury here in the UK, which is the Central Finance Ministry, and then in a whole range of other departments. And I ended up the last 10 years or so of my career as the most senior official in several departments. In turn, one was the Department for Transport, where I was what's known as the Permanent Secretary for 5 years, the Home Office, where I was Permanent Secretary for 3 years, and I was also briefly Permanent Secretary of the Department for Business. So essentially running large, complicated organisations, trying to provide leadership to, in those cases, tens of thousands of people.
Wow. What a kind of wealth of experience and knowledge that we're going to be tapping into this afternoon. So what I think, if we start off with, because I think what we all want to hear is your leadership lessons and the wisdom that you've gleaned along the way. But I think if we set the scene with the context of What do you think is the greatest challenge facing the sector today?
So obviously challenges are going to vary a bit by country, by geography, but if you kind of pan right back, I think this is true. In some way, I think this will be true around the world. We're in a world now where economic growth is harder to come by than it was 15 years ago. Globalization has kind of, hasn't stopped, but it's sputtering, if you like, and economic growth is less. We're in a world where there's less stability, I think. We had a period at the end of the Cold War where it looked like the world was going to get more and more stable. Well, now I think there's a lot more instability globally. We look at what's happening in Ukraine, what's the tragic events in Israel and Gaza. And those are not by any means the only sources of instability. We look longer term at climate change. We look at the demographic pressures around the world. And then the third big factor, I think, for public servants everywhere is around technology. It's around the way in which technology is enabling whole new things, some of which, when we turn to AI, we may not even be sure what it's going to enable. And but also changing expectations, particularly amongst young, about citizens, about much more responsive and individual services. Now, you put all that together, that world framework of change of less economic growth at the moment, more instability, realms of technology that we're really not sure about. And I think the environment for public servants is about how to make sense of all of that, how to respond to those challenges and deliver outstanding public services based on really, really strong set of values. So I don't think there's one challenge, as it were, but if you look around the world, I think there's a range of factors which will shape every one of the countries that we live and work in, and every one of those public services. May seem indirect, but I think that all those really big factors have an effect.
Yes, and I think you're right. I think there's definitely a feeling of uncertainty and unpredictability. I think, a lot of the things that have happened over the last few years have definitely made a lot of people, both in the sector and wider, feel maybe less comfortable, and actually that it's a really important skill to develop as to how to use adversity to grow. How do we actually positively respond to challenges when we can't really foresee them? And I mean, you mentioned AI, and there was that interesting conversation recently between our Prime Minister and Elon Musk I was listening to. Should we talk about AI? What role do you think that might play in the sector? I mean, could it help us in some areas, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely, it could help us. And yet at the same time, we need to be really thoughtful and invest in the kind of capacity, the expertise that will help us to navigate our way through the technology like AI. So here in the UK, when I was a permanent secretary, we were using AI already to change processes very significantly. So the processes in relation to things like visa issuance. When I was in the Home Office, we had really large, complicated visa operation overseas, and we changed the way in which visas operated to automate more of the processes using AI, using some robotics, and greatly reducing the amount of time it took to process visas, but actually also trying to enrich the jobs of the colleagues that we had working on visas. Complicated change program. So technology in, I think, public services is a huge potential to improve the effectiveness of services, improve the quality of services, reduce cost, improve productivity, and actually deliver more interesting and rewarding jobs for colleagues. It's not to say that's easy to do, but there is a load of potential in public services with technology. At the same time, and this is what came out, I think, of the conversation we were talking about between the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and Elon Musk, we have, as public services, governments have got to be really thoughtful about the risk. And in particular around what's known as frontier AI, so technologies which are self-generative, potentially at some point achieve what's known as singularity in terms of having the, all the capacity that is, not all the capacity, but a great deal of capacity that's reflected in a human being, but also the computational ability of a computer. There are some significant risks, and that's why all those countries came together at the summit and talked about the need to start investing in individually and together through the UN in understanding the safety issues around AI. So I put technology up there as one of the really big challenges because it has got all this positive potential, but it does also have those risks.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure those of you who are joining today or watching this back will agree with this, but I think there is so much potential when it comes to technology, but also, as you say, we have to really be very mindful about that. I don't know if there are any comments or questions, Chris, on the chat. I can't see anything coming up here, but okay. If you have any comments or questions, please remember to just pop them in and we'll address them as we can. So this leads very nicely into leadership styles.
Yeah.
How do you think sort of leadership styles have evolved, and what kind of style is required when, this huge blue sky thinking of all these different things that are required but are also very challenging? Times have changed and we're working in such a fast-paced environment. How do you think sort of leadership styles have evolved, and what type of styles of leadership do you think are needed to future-proof the sector?
When I joined public service back in the 1980s, people didn't even really talk about leadership. They talked about, what you had to do. You got instructions from on high, they came down, and you did that. I think one way in which it's evolved is that we do actually now reflect on and think about what kind of leadership is needed in order to make sense of the world, in order to respond. That's huge positive. I pick out three things about what I think is needed in the kind of context we talked about. The first is to draw on the talents of all the people that we have and the talents that we can access in the world that we can recruit from, attract from, work with. So there's a thing here about, we tend to talk about diversity, equality, inclusion as a moral issue, and it absolutely is a moral issue. It's an overriding ethical imperative, but it's also absolutely key business sense for any organization, public sector organizations, which need to make sure they reflect the society they serve, but also make the very most of all the talent that they can access. That's the first thing. The second thing, I think, is giving people, again, in this kind of world of uncertainty and unpredictability, you can't give them certainty that doesn't exist, but you can give them a sense of purpose, a sense of inspiration, the reason why we're here. So leaders, managers used to kind of focus on the what. This is what you need to do. I always used to say to the people I tried to lead, think about the why, make sense of the context to the people you're leading. And you can't tell people to be led. Well, you can try, but they'll only be led if it comes from within. So, and that relates to providing that sense of purpose, that overriding sense of why are we here, what can we achieve. The third thing I think is, what kind of sense of leadership is needed is about being, integrity, putting integrity at the heart of it. Integrity has taken a bit of a buffeting in some ways in the UK, we look at political events over the last years, but I think that we have to really invest in putting integrity back at the heart of public service to maintain the confidence of the people, the population we're serving, and also to attract the very best people. So those would be the three things I pick out: diversity, equality, inclusion, integrity, and the overriding sense of purpose. They're all really about values.
Yes.
And one of the things I learned as a public service leader is it has to be a value-led organisation, value-led world.
I think they're very thoughtful answers, and I thought of Simon Sinek when you said about the why. Have you read his book?
No, I'm not.
It's a great book, all about why we should start with the purpose. And I agree with you, and I think that's a really important angle to come at it. I think it's easier to say than to do, isn't it? I think it's important to sort of have that vision and to try to lead people in that way. But I can imagine some people who are joining us today will say, well, that's easy to say. How do you actually do that? How do you ensure that you don't get stuck in, I just have to get these things done, we have to achieve these goals or these targets or these outcomes? Because actually, to cultivate the why and the purpose, you really have to invest time in people.
You do, and I agree, it's not straightforward. The easy route is just to focus on the what, with maybe a bit of how thrown in, the rules-based approach. I think the thing that distinguishes, leadership is being able to provide people with more context, explain why these tasks are necessary, what difference they're going to make, and to help locate the activity, the functions of this team, this division, this organization in a bigger picture. Now, that's really it. I don't think it takes a huge amount of time. It does take some reflection. It maybe takes a slightly different bit of the brain, a more reflective, more, the reflective moment. But boy, is it important. I'm just trying to think about how I learned to do it, I guess. And I suppose what I realised, I certainly wasn't something I began by doing. What I realised was that, essentially my journey was to go from being a kind of policy analyst, doing lots of detailed analysis of options, into somebody who could only achieve things through others. And I came to realise that the only way I could really achieve things through others, of course I could tell them what to do, but it's quite limiting. But the way to achieve things through others is to enable them to use more of their judgment, empower them more, and to do that they had to have a bigger sense of purpose.
Yeah, it's quite interesting you say that. It reminds me of a time. So I was a CEO of a charity some years ago, and I remember getting this feeling that when I wasn't doing everything. So I remember this about raising money. So we were fundraising, and I remember talking to one of my mentors about the fact that someone in my team was going to bring this huge donation in, and that feeling of, rather than celebrating that, I felt like I wasn't being a strong leader because I wasn't the one doing that. And that mentor reminded me of a really good lesson, which was that your job is to enable your team to work towards these goals, not for you to do those things. It was a good leadership lesson to learn, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. So okay, I'm sure I didn't manage to do this all the time, far from it. But again, at my best, I would hope that I recognised that my job was to create a team that essentially could manage without me.
Yes.
They had, they embodied, acquired that entire sense of purpose. They could communicate that sense of purpose to the people who worked for them.
Yeah.
They could make sense of the context we were operating within, and they were the ones who were achieving things, and the people working for them were the ones who were achieving things, not me.
Yes, yeah.
There was another one. This is slightly cliched, but I remember the chief exec of a really large business once powerfully, whom I was working with, powerfully talking to me about how leaders really, the classic picture of an organization is a pyramid going upwards. Think about that pyramid, flip it round. The job of the leadership team at the bottom is to support and enable the capability of all the people who are now at the top. That vast capability that exists in an organisation 1, 2, 3, 4 levels down from the top leadership. So flip it round. Think about what your job is as a leader in helping the people, creating an environment in which the people beneath you are able to make more of the choices for themselves, wiser choices, align with the overall purpose of the organisation that bit more effectively. If you can just achieve that a bit more at the margins, like 5 degrees out of 360 degrees, tighter alignment, the power of that, given the number of people, is enormous.
I love that visual representation. I think a lot of us will take that away. I think that's a great concept and what a wise person.
I should credit it then with Andrew Whitty, who's chief executive, chief executive GSK at the time.
Okay, just in case he comes after this and says that was my idea. Brilliant. Yes, I like that. So we've had some questions in from the chat, so maybe we can take a couple of those. Tony says, how do you think the UK civil service will change in response to criticisms by successive governments about responsiveness to political policy goals?
So I think it's quite uncertain, really. I mean, I think the truth is the outlook for the civil service. So personally, I think the outlook for the civil service over the next 10 years is uncertain. It's easy to suppose that we kind of, can have some reversion to the world as it was, say, in 2010 or maybe 2014. I'm not sure that we will. I think actually, if you look at, so I was in the civil service for a long time. The really big change, it seemed to me, was actually not in the last few years, but really was go back to the Blair government and go back to the way in which the Blair government responded to another change, which was the intensity of the media cycle. When things were, when everything was worked more slowly, the traditional relationship between ministers and civil servants kind of, you could see how it held. But with the intensity of the media cycle, that gave rise, I think, to the advent of really powerful special advisors, very capable special advisors, often under the Blair government. And that has created a bit of instability, really, in the kind of constitutional relationship between ministers and civil servants in the UK. And I don't think we worked that all the way through. And quite a lot of the stuff that we see, now, whether it's the COVID inquiry, whether it's the frustration of some ministers in the past, I think relates to that instability. We may continue to be in a world where it's sort of things are not quite resolved, or we might have some new disposition, new constitutional settlement. There's quite a lot of work that's happening, not inside government, but the Institute for Government, for example, is doing a big piece of work on this at the moment. You could see a world, here's one hypothesis, you could see a world where actually the role of the civil service is narrowed a bit. At the moment, the civil service constitution has got this incredibly broad role in everything apart from party political affairs, to be the closest, in principle, the closest advisors to ministers. It's actually not necessarily quite how it works. You could see a world where the role of the civil service is a bit more tightly defined, and there's more tightly defined accountability about that for the delivery of certain functions, tightly specified with clear accountability and measurement around that. That's one trajectory.
Yes, I think that's very interesting. And Ashley has asked, what's been the impact on leadership in a predominantly hybrid world, particularly large department or ministry? I think that's a very good question.
So I think it's, well, the predominantly hybrid world, I should confess, predominantly hybrid arrived, I left government in the UK in 2020, predominantly hybrid arrived with COVID after that. But obviously, I'm working in that way now myself, and I think that the I think it increases the challenge for leadership. Leadership works best when it's face to face, when there's a human. It's all about relationships. So when you can make that human relationship face to face, personally, I think that is most effective. So if I think back to the kind of seminal moments when I realised I needed to do something different as a leader, they came out of face-to-face occasions. They came out of occasions when I, suddenly was confronted by 200 angry people, for example, working in the organisation, and I realised I needed to do different things differently. Online, that is harder, I think. So what I've seen is a kind of conscious investment of time and effort in making the most of the online forum, but also in finding ways of making that physical presence. You kind of counterbalance that with more emphasis, if you like, on physical presence.
Do you think it's been a good thing, though, in some ways? Because I know this topic has come up before in other conversations with, and certainly there's been some discussion around before, when hybrid wasn't such a thing as it is now. We would have lots of meetings for meeting's sake in person because that would be how we were used to doing things. And now, because we have to work that bit harder to see people in person, do you feel that that has increased the quality of interactions and the intention?
Actually, I'm slightly sceptical about that. I think there's still, unfortunately, quite a lot of meetings for meeting's sake. They definitely start more promptly. There always used to be a kind of 5-minute faffing around at the beginning. They start more promptly. I think the gain I would see actually is about the balance between travel time and working time. That actually, I think quite a lot of that tends to go to the employer as an advantage. But there are also advantages for the employee. So I think there is a productivity gain, a kind of short-term productivity gain associated with hybrid working. Longer term, the issue is about driving how to sustain better relationships, how to integrate new colleagues, how to drive innovation, how to make things, if you like, the online space tends to be more transactional. The strategic space needs to be more face-to-face if you really want to deliver change.
Okay. Let's go to a couple more questions. So it looks like somebody knows you because they've said lovely to see you.
Okay,
but they are
you too.
What do you say to those people who feel that their leadership is failing in maintaining their values, especially in the eve of move away from the focus on diversity and equality?
So I'm going to assume this is a comment about the UK civil service. I think we need to, I have huge sympathy for my colleagues, my former colleagues who are still leaders in the civil service. They have a very, very hard job. The UK civil service works for, constitutionally, quite rightly, the government of the day. It's the government of the day that sets the agenda, sets the parameters, sets the rules within the law and civil service code and all of that. What I would say to you is hang in there. I don't think there's a fundamental change. I see no shift at all in the fundamental values of the civil service. I think it's been a pretty lean time. I understand that it's been a hard time, particularly in the, some of the media attacks on the civil service. I do think that has waned. Thank goodness it has waned. And I would, if I were in the civil service still, what I would be trying to do every day is to bring people back to that fundamental purpose in a democratic system of serving the public through the government of the day.
Okay. Just looking at other questions. I'll let you, can you see those and see if you want?
Yeah, I can see someone as a rich choice. Do I want to do the COVID inquiry language or any pieces of civil service reform? All right, let me do the COVID. Hang on, there's one says, I was appalled at the language being used in the COVID inquiry by officials.
So do you have any, just for people who might not be able to see this for some reason, do you have any reflections on affecting cultural change as a leader and how that balances with individuals bringing their authentic selves to work?
So, look, there's an awful lot that's coming out through the COVID inquiry, which is, makes me pretty sad. Including some of the stuff about officials, as well as even more ministers and special advisors. Let's people that use WhatsApp in a way that sometimes they might have spoken in previous years. They might have spoken freely, and that doesn't make it any better. But it is a bit of context. Who knows what was being said in the 1970s? I mean, probably, thank goodness, some of it is not written down. Probably pretty shocking. What we, there's one version of that, which is one response to that, which is to say, be very careful what you write down. But actually, much more important than that is to encourage people to be really thoughtful about the effect, the responsibility they have, tremendous responsibility to public servants of making decisions or giving advice on things which affect people's lives, to be really thoughtful about that and reflective about it. It goes back to and sometimes one can lose perspective. Ultimately the jobs we do in public service have got to be moral. Have got to carry moral authority.
Absolutely.
And we all make mistakes. We absolutely all make mistakes. I've said things I've regretted. And so I think a bit of tolerance and allowance for that is needed. But fundamentally, we have to recognise not just that we're accountable in moments where we get exposed, but that we have to be accountable to ourselves and our conscience in times that are private.
Absolutely. There's a question here which actually links nicely to one of the questions I was going to ask you, which is about what skills should leaders be looking to develop or attract, and are there any particular sources you'd recommend looking at? So that was what I was going to be asking you about.
Right.
What qualities do you need to possess? But I think this is a better question from Vicky.
So what's oh, sorry, hang on.
What skills should leaders be
looking to
in any particular sources?
Any particular sources, right. So we all, leadership, you probably, colleagues on the call are probably familiar with the kind of T-shaped model of leadership, which I'm sure you can explain better than me, Kat. But basically, my understanding of that was you start your career as some kind of relatively narrow or defined area of expertise. For me, it was policy analysis, but it could have been economics, it could have been law, or something like that. Okay, that's fine. You then, to progress to become a leader, actually, you have to get a certain competence in a much, much broader range.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's a bit of functional piece in that, so you have to know what the right question. If you're an economist, you have to know what the right questions are to ask policy people or lawyers or whatever like that. But in particular, leadership is relational. It's about relationships. It's about I always used to think about it, my job, in kind of three parts, which is there's the work. Yes.
Yep.
There's the people who are looking to me
for
a sense of direction, for guidance, for some ability to make sense of this chaotic, unstable world. And then there's the people up and out who, often ministers, need to be managed in some way. Right? I need to take the burden off the people beneath me for that world up and out. So what's my advice on skills? Well, first of all, do a self-diagnosis. Understand what you're good at and what you're not so good at. because we're all not good at many things.
Yes, absolutely.
Second piece of self-diagnosis is to think about, well, what are you trying to achieve? What are you really trying to achieve in the next 3, 4, 5 years, say? And then the next bit is obviously think, well, if that's what you're trying to achieve, and to achieve that, you need to be better at these 1 or 2 things. How are you going to get that? How are you going to get a bit more experience, a bit more confidence in those things? Be realistic. By the time, people keep changing. There's a lot of plasticity in the brain, I'm learning, but one needs to be realistic rather than suppose you can't completely change your personality. So it's usually about shifting things a bit at the margin, but you can change. So be ambitious but realistic. And then here's perhaps the best tip. Think about how you're going to complement the things you're not so good at by hiring and having other people around you who are.
Yeah.
So, for me, I would always want, I'd always want a PA who is fantastic with people, very friendly, because people would often, may not have found me all that friendly, at least at first sight. So I'd want some people around me who help to make people feel really at ease. That's just one example. The more complex your organisation, the more ways in which you can complement the things you're not so good at with other people. So think about it as a team game.
I think they're really, really good points. And I think, I don't know if you have got any ideas on this, but are there any, resources? Particularly if you are in a position at the moment, one of the parts of this in conversation, and one of the reasons why I think we've had such a good number of people joining and registering, is because I think there's a lot of talent in the sector. There are a lot of people wanting to progress. And the very first in conversation we had actually was with Nathan White, and he talked about the civil service being, he wrote a paper on navigating the labyrinth, which is how he described his progression within the sector. And he came and shared some ideas and advice about what had worked for him. But I do appreciate that it's not so straightforward for some individuals to navigate how do they move into those more senior roles. So I think this is really useful for people who are joining or watching this back to think about, well, what can I do to build my skills? Are there any resources or places that you think people can go once they've identified doing what you shared, self-diagnosis?
Look, I'm sure there are. I'm afraid I can't think of any immediately.
Okay.
Civil Service College.
Yes.
Training materials, put in that plug. But no, look, there are. I'm just trying to think what I use. For me, actually, it was not so much training, not so much formal things as listening to people.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that another thing? A network, finding mentors.
Yeah, but it was find wise people with more experience who can judge you dispassionately but have your interests at heart. Finding those are gold dust.
Yeah.
I go back to the people I would, people like my PA, for example. I had some fantastic PAs. They gave me fantastic feedback. So encouraging feedback from people who are different from you. Yeah. In some way, maybe, but also, you can trust completely. Those two, right? Are some other resources here. This may not be relevant to the people on the call, but the best learning experiences for me, to be honest, were always when I made mistakes. I made plenty of mistakes, but I'm a reasonably resilient person. So once I got over the initial shock, the denial of a mistake, it's a fantastic experience because it really, really, really stays with you. If you're not making any mistakes, you're probably not.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have talked about that actually with Paul White in the past as well. So I think that's learning from failure. Think about when you're a child.
Yeah.
How you learn how to ride a bike, or some of those simple things. You have to fall off.
But think about when, I mean, that's good for me. Learning to ride a bike. I suppose the professional equivalent to learning to ride a bike was when I was involved in a reorganisation in about 2002, and we had to take 5 different agencies and turn it into one. And this is when I ended up with a crowd of 200 angry people.
Okay, that sounds like a good story.
Because we were getting, my boss in this new agency had said there were going to be, instead of 200 jobs, they're going to be 100 jobs,
okay.
115 jobs.
Okay.
Let's just say we did not communicate that well. And I was the one responsible for the communication. So there were lots of understandably angry people who, and I came at that having been a Treasury official, where the most number of people I ever had responsibility for was 20. So you can tell that's 20 years later, that still sticks with me. Good news in that case is that obviously we did have to make reductions in jobs. We did adjust the way we were doing it to make sure we're treating people fairly and decently and as much as we could. But the good news is that then eventually, by kind of understanding how we messed up, we actually developed ultimately a very strong relationship with it. Dealt fairly with the people who left and developed a very strong relationship with the people who stayed. So, we all of us make mistakes. I think that professional mistakes, and those are probably the best learning.
Yeah, and being able to sort of, I think, admit or own up to and learning from it, because otherwise, how do you grow? Even if whether you're an aspiring leader or a leader. So there are quite a few questions now, which is great coming in. Shall we have a little look? If we could just scroll through, because there are quite a lot of questions coming in now. I'll just take maybe 1 or 2 more, and it's already almost 3:45 here in the UK. So we've been chatting for almost 45 minutes, which you won't even believe. So we'll just take maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and then we'll just get some thoughts for closing. I don't know if there are any more questions there, Chris.
So hang on, there was one about integrity and authenticity.
So in a world where integrity and authenticity, says Hilary, is more important than ever, how do organizations guard against insincerity where words and deeds don't match?
So it is, I'd say it's particular. This can be tough in any organization which has to present a face to the world. It can be very tough in the civil service, where the civil service can't contradict, except in extreme circumstances. The political stance being taken by ministers of any government, and it arises in any government. I think that the way I found to deal with this, and it's true under governments of every complexion, was just to try to be very clear about what my responsibility as a leader of the civil service was, and what lay in the political sphere and belonged properly to ministers and politicians, and to be very as straight as possible about the things that lay in my sphere. To say if I don't know, to say I don't know. If I do know and I can't say, to say that too. And so you can spend quite a long time, I think, in quite an agonised position in the civil service by trying to bridge those two things: the you know, the stance being taken by ministers on something and the stance elsewhere. I had loads and loads of select committee appearances, which were some of them quite awkward. But you can't, you know, at the end of the day, you've got a certain role in the civil service, and it's that role which you have to fulfil with complete integrity and authenticity. You can't be answerable for the things that ministers are doing.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a quite interesting one. If we just take one more question from the chat. This one here. So one of the very critical skills a leader needs to possess is to manage people and drive them to achieve the goals of the ministry or the government. How does one react to a feeling or observation that the quality of the workforce, especially at senior management, is unfortunately going down? I see lesser commitment, seriousness and follow-up on assignment, quality of papers not standard. How does a head of ministry turn around this situation, especially as recruitment staff is centralised and not at ministry level?
Okay, so I think one of the key roles of the leader of an organisation, and whether we're talking about a team here or a whole department of state of tens of thousands of people, one of the key roles is to set standards and to hold people accountable for standards. And by the way, I think that is quite inspiring. Done right, it can be inspiring. Nobody wants to be doing mediocre work and working in a mediocre organisation. To say that this, you know, is the Department for Transport. I thought when I was Home Secretary of the Department for Transport, we were as good a Department for Transport as any in the world, and I wanted us to stay there and be even better. That's an inspiring message, but it's, you know, it's also a tough message if you're saying to people this work is not good enough. You can say it nicely, say it encouragingly, but you do have to quite often say this needs to be done again, needs to be done better, and to create that culture down through the organisation of high standards, high expectations. I don't know whether what is said about the standards of senior management now is true or not. I'd rather doubt it, to be honest. Obviously, in the UK, I know quite a lot of people and lots of really, really talented people. But it does start with the top. It starts with the expectations and standards that are set from the top and people are being held to account for.
So just on that, how do you develop good skills in giving feedback? We were talking about it actually in a session this morning here. I don't think, and this isn't just the public sector, I think this is the private sector, and there's another question about the differences between leading and both, but I definitely feel across the board in the UK we don't have a strong culture of giving constructive feedback, being able to give direct feedback. How does one, as a leader or an aspiring leader, develop that? Because that is so important. Otherwise, how do you grow? But there's definitely some fear or maybe some inexperience. I don't feel like that's an area that we have, you know, as a society, we're very strong at.
I think that's fair. Actually, I think it probably reflects in British case to a certain, you know, politeness and reserve, and there's a lot of hedging around.
Yes.
If you've ever worked with Dutch people, my experience is they give very direct feedback very quickly. So I think actually it's a skill that can be coached and developed. It's quite a, you know, there are some techniques that you can use, you can learn, you can apply, you can develop, and then you can teach other people how to do it. Personally, what things I found always useful were, first of all, to prepare. Don't suppose that you can do it without, you know, probably you may need twice as much time in preparation as you do in the doing. Second, to have a clear objective from the feedback. Usually that objective is to enable the individual to go out of the room, out of the conversation, motivated. So overall, with a positive motivation, right, not in a negative place overall, but knowing how and what they need to do better. So usually that would be some combination of a positive message, person being valued, and then some specifics with examples. Nothing worked. The thing I used to be actually not quite so good at as I should have been is collecting the examples as I went along, and also the other thing to do is to do it as close in time as possible.
Yes.
To the event.
Yes. Yeah.
So do it regularly.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Otherwise, it can cause all sorts of issues.
Yeah.
I think just in terms of time, I know there's still quite a few questions. I don't think we're going to get through too many more. I think what would be useful to hear from you, as we have lots of leaders joining this conversation, and as I said, some aspiring leaders potentially. What would be your kind of one golden nugget? What would be your one piece of advice to give to those who are maybe struggling in their leadership role, or wanting to progress into a leadership role and not quite sure how to do that?
One piece of advice.
Or you can give us two if you like, if you can't narrow it down.
Okay, so your job, the job of a leader, is to enable the people you are leading to give their very best.
Absolutely.
For the organisation. It's got to be linked to organisational purpose. So they are only going to be able to give their very best if you can set the context for them, explain, help to explain the world to them, and engage their sense of purpose, the why. The more powerful you can make the why, the better. And if you can link that to some specifics about the how and the what. So clear framework for what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, some specificity, but linked to this overarching sense of purpose. That's a general point. I think the thing that actually marks every good leader, I think, is being able to relate to people, and that means being able to communicate effectively with them. There are lots of different communication styles. Listening is as important as communicating. But if there's one thing everybody on this call, whether they're an existing leader or an aspirant leader, might want to think about is, are you communicating, listening as well as broadcasting, as effectively as you might? Is there something you can hone in that?
Absolutely. Wow, I mean, I can't believe we've been talking for almost an hour. It's I think we could talk for hours about this topic. It's been really quite incredible. I think I just want to make a couple of sort of final points. So I really want us to take away that upside down pyramid image. I think that's very powerful, and thinking of ourselves as leaders rather than the top of the pyramid and the bottom of the pyramid. I think what you said about why is also a very important point to take away. And for those of you who haven't read Simon Sinek's book, I would highly recommend it. It's a really interesting read. And I think we should absolutely be encouraging more focus on feedback, because I really think that that's one area where, if we can get more comfortable in having perhaps what might be deemed as difficult conversations, we're going through another very challenging time. And as we talked about right at the beginning of the conversation, there are so many things that are changing, and in order to future-proof the civil service, we don't know what will happen in the next 5 or 10 years. What we can do, though, is to ensure that we are as well equipped as leaders, and that we are growing. And I think that's something I talk quite a lot about in my role as Associate Director here of Wellbeing and Resilience. Is just, we don't always know the how, but we need to sort of have that, be constantly developing ourselves, mentally, physically, and in all areas, to be the best leaders. And I think I want to ask you one final question, if I may. Can you tell us one of your role models? Can you think of, I mean, you shared about that the one, this one example with the pyramid. Is there one thing you remember as a sort of takeaway from one of your role models?
Yeah, so like in the first 10 years of my career, I suppose I did have a mentor. I didn't describe him in that way, or and I don't think he described himself in that way. Let's call him Steve for this purpose.
Okay.
And the thing that was really outstanding, things that really are outstanding for me about Steve were first that kind of sense of purpose. He really cared about why we were there, and he was able to instill that in a very succinct, powerful, vivid way in everybody who came into contact with him. Second, he cared about people. So I remember, all right, here's one feedback conversation I had with Steve. I went in for my annual review. His first question to me was, Philip, why don't you smile more?
Brilliant.
All right, that's like 1992. So
what was your answer to that question?
Oh,
do you remember?
I said, well, I think most of these things are psychological, aren't they, Steve? And he said, yes. His wife was a psychologist, by the way. So that then made me ponder. Maybe I'm working a bit too hard here. The other thing were two other things. One was he was incredibly prompt and responsive. So you ask a question, you go, I never managed that level of promptness. But that was quite inspiring as well. It's kind of not always achievable. And the final thing was he always left work at 5 o'clock. In this incredibly busy organisation, all this pressure, I'd be there toiling away, and I'd go around and want to talk to him, he'd be gone.
Interesting.
So it can be achieved. I never managed to achieve. I did learn to smile more. I never managed to leave work at 5 o'clock unless there was some domestic.
That's so interesting. You know, that's just reminded me of a Danish boss that I had. I think she was probably the most inspiring leader that I've had in my career. And it didn't matter whether we were traveling to Boston or Norway. She would always get off the plane with this yoga mat rolled up under her arm. And I remember thinking, wow, this woman is a serious leader. She's really incredible person, leader, mother, but also still somehow finds time to stretch on a yoga mat.
And you know what? The Danes, like the Dutch, are also very good at direct feedback.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. This has been such a pleasure. I just saw a quick comment from somebody saying they had to dash off, but it was very, very useful. So honestly, I can't thank you enough, Philip, for joining us today. It's been very insightful. As you see, we could have talked for a very long time. There were lots of questions, lots of people saying they've got to go to another meeting. Brilliant session. Thank you. Great insight and learning. So yes. So thank you again to those of you who are joining live or who are watching the recording. We had an incredible amount of you joining today, so we will go back through the chat and check to see if whether you felt that this time was a good time, and we might think about that for 2024. If you have any thoughts on future speakers or topics, please pop it in the chat. Really, it's such a delight to have had this time with you, Philip, and to interview people in this way. It's really great. I really enjoy it, and I think, as we can see from the comments that are coming in, everybody does at home as well, which is great. So that's all from us. This is the lasting conversation for 2023. Very much looking forward to guests in 2024. And again, thank you once again to you, Philip, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, wish you a rest of your great day. Thank you. Bye.